good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you're watching from. I'm Janice Kaminer-Resnick, and I welcome you on behalf of the leadership team here at America at a Crossroads, which is a project of Jews United for Democracy and Justice. Along with me are former Congressman Mel Levine and former Los Angeles County Supervisor Zev Yaroslavsky. Many thanks to Max Boot for being with us. We are so pleased to once again have you as our guest. Max is one of the most knowledgeable voices on all matters related to Russia and Ukraine, foreign policy, and military issues, and more. We are so grateful to have you back tonight to learn from your expert analysis of the state of the war in Ukraine and U.S. policy in connection to the war. Just to remind you, anyone can watch any of our weekly programs after the fact via podcast or YouTube. All the info and the links are in our emails, or you can just go to our website, JewsUnitedForDemocracy.org, or to our YouTube channel, America at a Crossroads, and you'll get all the different connections. Next week, on July 23rd at 5 o'clock, that's Wednesday, leading public opinion analyst Paul Maslin and Republican political consultant Michael Murphy will be in conversation with Pat Morrison on a topic that we've been putting off, but we need to begin to address, and that is, what does Washington's chaos portend for the 2026 midterms? And they are two fantastic people to get us started in that conversation. Without further ado, please welcome tonight's moderator, Warren Olney. Warren produced and hosted many public radio shows and podcasts over his many years as a broadcast journalist. You might be familiar with his nationally syndicated show, To the Point, which ran for almost 2 decades. Warren and his programs have received more awards than I can mention here, more than 40 awards for broadcast excellence, including Golden Mics and Lifetime Achievement Awards. That is all separate and apart from the years that Warren served with distinction as a reporter and then as a very popular anchor on the nightly news. Warren, thank you for being with us, and tonight's show is now in your hands.
Janice, you are very kind, and thank you very much for that introduction. Let me introduce Max Boot. He is a historian, he is a foreign policy analyst, and he's a leading authority on armed conflict. Born in Moscow, raised in Los Angeles. Interviewed many times on America at a Crossroads, most recently last year, to talk about the latest of his 5 books. It's called Reagan, His Life and Legend. And since we spoke, it's become a bestseller, named one of the best books of 2024 by both the Washington Post and the New Yorker magazine. Another of his books is called The Corrosion of Conservatism, Why I Left the Right. Interesting take on how he's thinking. The foreword is called Max Boot, one of the 50 most influential Jewish Americans. He's a former editor of the Wall Street Journal and the Christian Science Monitor. He's a current fellow at the Council of Foreign Relations. He's a familiar guest on CNN and MSNBC, and he is a weekly columnist at the Washington Post. Max Boot, great to have you back again.
Always a pleasure to be back with you, Warren, and love this series. Love what Jews United for Democracy and Justice has been doing, and it's really been a privilege to be on so many times since this discussion series started, which I think brings so much good sense to the airwaves.
Well, congratulations too on the sale of the book since the last time we talked about it. Maybe we had something to do about it. Who knows?
Absolutely. I think that is the secret to selling books, is going on America at the Crossroads.
Well, you're an expert and an authority on military power. You have been very critical of President Trump, both with respect to the war in Ukraine and also his relationship with Vladimir Putin. In the past few days, he has changed his tune, says he is not happy with Putin, says he has authorized shipping some defensive missiles to Ukraine. He's talked about other elements, other issues, as well as a potential things for the United States to do. Are you reassured by this? Is he seeing the light?
I am surprised, and I am, positively surprised, because my concern was that given Trump's long history of pro-Russian and anti-Ukrainian sentiments, my concern was that he was simply going to abandon Ukraine. And I think those concerns, only increased in February when he had that famous shouting match with President Zelensky in the Oval Office. And it really looked like the U.S. was abandoning its support for Ukraine. And now I think things look a little bit different after this week, where President Trump announced that he was going to be allowing our European allies to buy weapons that they will then ship on to Ukraine, including evidently Patriot missiles, which is something that the Ukrainians really need because they are under very heavy attack from Russian drones and missiles. And Trump also announced that he was going to impose, crushing 100% tariffs on Russia and its trade partners if Putin doesn't make peace in 50 days, i.e., by September 2nd. Now, I think the tariff threat is the less credible part of what he said, because as we know, Trump loves to make threats about tariffs, and sometimes he carries them out, sometimes he doesn't. In this case, I think it would be very hard to carry out because, who are the biggest trade partners for Russia right now? Who are the biggest buyers of Russian oil and gas? It's China and India. And obviously, we have a very complicated relationship with both countries, especially with China, where, we've already been in a trade war with them. And I don't think Trump is necessarily going to upset that by stopping 100% tariffs, which basically means the end of U.S. trade with China, which, could spell an economic recession for the U.S. and the entire world. And of course, India is a country with which we are often in alignment. So I'm not sure we're going to go to economic war with India either. But I think just the fact that Trump is saying this and the fact that he is willing to sell weapons to Ukraine, it's not enough, but it's a huge improvement over where he was over the last 6 months. And I think it's a pleasant surprise. And it's something that I think Vladimir Putin was not banking on, because I think Putin was counting on Trump to abandon Ukraine and therefore let Putin try to achieve his objectives on the ground. And that objective, of course, is to turn Ukraine into a Russian colony. And I think now the prospects for Ukraine are looking up, because it seems like the United States is not abandoning Ukraine after all.
On the other hand, as you say, the 500% tariff poses a lot of problems that we don't have now, particularly with China and India and other countries as well. We basically have to stop doing business with them at 500%. A lot of people are saying, remember Taco, the statement that Trump always I forget the last part of it. Anyway, you know what it means. And always chickens out. Thank you. Trump always chickens out. What about that? And are you fearful? You made an allusion to it as you were speaking, that once again we might see him back away.
Well, again, I don't ascribe that much credibility to the tariff threat. I don't think the markets do either, which is why you saw the Russian stock market actually rise after his announcement. So I don't think, the tariffs are necessarily going to be imposed, but simply the fact that he's even threatening that, I think, suggests that he's changed his view of the conflict. I mean, remember, it was only a few months ago that he was basically blaming President Zelensky for Ukraine getting invaded and taking a very pro-Russian line. Remember, going back to 2022, when this Russian invasion began, he called it so smart, an act of genius. So there was a lot of concern, I think, rightly so, that about what he would do. And so I think it is good news that he is not walking away from Ukraine. By the way, I would add, he's also not walking away from NATO. I thought that was very interesting that he made his announcement on Monday in the Oval Office with the NATO Secretary General, and he had some very nice warm words for NATO. Again, keep in mind that when he came into office this second time around, there were a lot of expectations, including from folks like John Bolton, Trump's former national security advisor, that Trump would actually exit NATO because he has been so scathing about the alliance. But the European powers have basically been able to win him over with these pledges of spending 5% of GDP on defense, a lot of which is smoke and mirrors, but it satisfied Trump. And he's really come around. And so, what he's doing right now is not as good as I would like to see. I think there's a lot more we can do, and we can talk about that. But while it's not as good as one could hope, it's a lot better than what I had feared.
Before we get to what he might do, you said that the Russian stock market went up. One of the prominent Russian spokespeople said he thought that Trump was full of hot air. What kind of treatment does he get in the Russian media? What does it suggest about the way that Vladimir Putin views him?
Well, the Russian media have basically suggested in the past, the state media have suggested that Putin is kind of in Russia's back pocket And I think his actions this week kind of shake up that assumption because I think that Putin thought he could manipulate Trump. I think Putin's calculation was he didn't have to make any concessions, even though Trump made clear he wanted the war to end. Putin, had all these half a dozen phone calls with Trump, and he was, pleasant and nice, as Trump said. But then the next night, the bombs would fall on Kiev or other cities. And I think Putin's calculation was Trump would just let him get away with this continuing aggression and that Putin could win on the ground because Trump would in fact abandon Ukraine. And I think the actions this week, although you can argue about their significance and how far they're going to go and all the rest of it, I think the actions this week shake up that Kremlin narrative and deal a blow to Putin's hopes of winning the war, which I think already were not that great.
When it comes to the war in Iraq, in Ukraine, there are a lot of people, including Vice President Vance, who have been warning against endless war, as they call it, warning that there might be nuclear war as a result of what's happening in Ukraine. And as he and the president lectured Zelensky in that incident you mentioned in the White House, they have said that Ukraine just can't win this war in Ukraine.
Well, I think the evidence shows otherwise. I think the evidence shows that Ukraine is winning the war because since the initial Russian invasion, well, I mean, the initial Russian invasion was actually in 2014, but since the Russian invasion ramped up in 2022, Russia did make some immediate gains. But since then, there's hardly been any change on the battlefield. I mean, Russian troops are advancing at a pace slower than troops were on the Western Front in World War I. And for very minimal gains, Putin is paying a very heavy price. I mean, Russia has lost roughly 1 million troops killed or wounded, huge numbers of tanks, artillery pieces, armored personnel carriers, aircraft, ships, all these other types of military hardware. So Russia, and despite all that, Ukraine continues to function as a pro-Western democracy. I mean, I think anybody who's been to Ukraine during the war, as I have been, comes away incredibly impressed by the resilience of the Ukrainian people. And that, sure, there is the war going on in the front line, and even in cities like Kiev or Odessa or elsewhere, you get air raids, you have to go to the bomb shelters, and apartment buildings get blown up, but nevertheless, life goes on. The streets are still crowded. People go to work. People go to cafes and restaurants. And so Ukraine has been surviving this war. And even though Russia has amassed something like 600,000 troops in and around Ukraine, I still don't see much evidence that the Russians are on the verge of any kind of breakthrough. And in fact, I think one of the most significant developments that we've seen in the last few years has been the development of Ukrainian defense industry. The Ukrainians are on track to produce more than 4 million drones this year, which is an amazing number, considering that the entire United States, we're a much larger, much richer country. The entire United States is only going to produce about 100,000 drones this year. The Ukrainians are going to produce over 4 million. And of course, the Russians are producing their own drones, but basically the prevalence of those drones over the battlefield have essentially frozen the front lines and made it almost impossible for troops to advance in either direction. So, I mean, that's bad in a sense because it means that Ukraine is not recovering the 20% of the territory that the Russians have occupied, but it's also good in the sense that it means that the Russians are unlikely to advance much beyond the 20% that they currently control. And so I think that could potentially set the basis for a ceasefire down the road. But first, I think we're going to have to see what happens with Putin's big summer offensive because he has to be convinced he is not going to win the war before he's going to negotiate seriously. And up until now, he's still been thinking that he can win the war.
I've seen it reported that Ukraine can make effective drones at a fraction of the cost that it takes the United States to make those drones.
Oh, absolutely. It's much, 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 much cheaper to make drones. In Ukraine, they have tremendous technological and industrial know-how, and they're able not just to make these drones very cheaply, but to innovate very quickly. And there's this constant battle of innovation between the Russians and the Ukrainians, where drones are changing on an almost daily basis, depending on what works and doesn't work on the front lines. And so it's staggering to see. This is a lot like the development of aviation during World War I, where the demands of warfare are pushing the industry to new heights. And you're seeing that certainly on both sides in Ukraine. But the fact that the Ukrainians have generally been slightly ahead on drones is all the more impressive because it's a much smaller, much poorer country than Russia, and yet they've been punching above their weight.
When Putin talks nice, to use the president's word, one day, and then the following day bombs Kyiv or something of that sort, is that sequence intentional? Is he trying to embarrass Trump and in the lives of the world?
I'm not sure he's trying to necessarily embarrass Trump, but I think what he's showing is he doesn't care what Trump says, even though he listens to Trump, saying, I want the war to end. And he does, I'm sure on the phone, Putin doesn't say, you're full of it. I'm sure he says something soothing and agreeable so that he doesn't directly confront Trump. But with the fact that he is at the same time stepping up the drone strikes and the missile strikes, he's showing that fundamentally he doesn't really care what Trump is saying. And I think this has been obvious for quite a while. And you can say, why is it taking Trump 6 months to figure this out? I mean, I wish he had figured it out sooner, but better late than never. And finally, I think Trump is getting the message that Putin is disrespecting him. And I think that's one thing that Trump reacts very poorly to, is being disrespected or being played for a patsy, where he feels like the other guy is not taking him seriously. And I think that was, part of the impetus for Trump bombing the Iranian nuclear facilities, because he thought the Iranians were not negotiating seriously enough on the nuclear deal. And I think you're seeing kind of the same dynamic play out with Russia right now.
When he has the vice president, at least in the past, and when he has Tucker Carlson and others inveighing against him for potentially getting into an endless war, does he have a political risk in upping the ante against Ukraine in the way that you suggest that he should?
I don't think so. I think, something like the Jeffrey Epstein affair is probably a bigger political risk for Trump, because that's something that truly animates his base. Whereas when it comes to Ukraine, I think there is a split in the Republican Party. And I think there's still a lot of kind of conventional anti-Russia, pro-Ukraine Republicans out there, especially in the Senate, who strongly support, aid to Ukraine. And of course, there is also kind of the more isolationist MAGA base, the Tucker Carlsons and others, who are anti-Ukraine, pro-Russia. But, they don't really have any place to go. At the end of the day, they're part of this Trumpist party. And I don't think, Trump, jumps around so much on issues. One day he's saying, release the Epstein file. The next day he's saying anybody who says release the Epstein file is a Democratic mole. People accept, people in this movement accept these kinds of bewildering flip-flops. And so I don't think that there's any real political risk for him supporting Ukraine. But I think it does show that there is kind of this tension among the positions that Trump advocates. There's kind of this internal incoherence, because on the one hand, he often talks about how he wants to end wars. And if you listen to his second inaugural address in January, he talked about how he's going to measure his success by the wars that he ends and by the wars he does not enter. But so he sounds like kind of a peacenik, isolationist, dovish kind of guy. But at the same time, he's very muscular and hawkish, talking about, how strongly he's going to hit anybody who messes with the United States. And so I think what you're seeing now is that the hawkish part of his persona is kind of in the driver's seat. And he's certainly acted very hawkishly on Iran. He's acting very hawkishly on Russia. And, I think it causes some grumbling among the more isolationist part of the MAGA base. But at the end of the day, I don't think that amounts to very much.
So he's only talked about the 500% tariff increase. He hasn't actually imposed it, and he has set a 50-day deadline for it. You said there are things that he could do that would be more effective anyway, and there are a lot of problems with that. What are they? What should he do?
Well, the immediate thing, I think the biggest priority is simply to rush weapons to Ukraine as quickly as possible, and especially Patriot interceptors, because that's an area where the Ukrainians are running low. And it takes a long time to produce Patriot systems. But, I think what we need to do is to tell the Europeans, and we may have done this already, is to tell the Germans and others, if you supply your additional Patriot batteries to Ukraine, the United States will backfill your own stockpiles over the next year or two as we produce more of these things. So I think that's the most immediate priority. But in terms of actually ending this war and making peace, I think the most important thing you can actually do would be to seize the 300 billion in frozen Russian funds that are trapped in the West. And what I've learned in the last few weeks is that a much larger portion than I had realized of that money is under American control. Phil Zelikow, who's a veteran U.S. national security official who's now at the Hoover Institution, Phil estimates that about 50 billion, 50 of those frozen Russian funds are held by American banks. That's much higher than an earlier estimate of just $5 billion. So if there is in fact $50 billion in Russian assets in American banks, we could just seize it any time. The president has the legal authority to do that. And imagine if we gave $50 billion to the Ukrainians to defend themselves. That's a massive amount of money. I mean, you're talking about, probably more in aid than the U.S. has delivered since the start of the war. That would enable the Ukrainians to turbocharge their defense industry, because right now they have a lot more defense capacity than they have money to pay for. But if they have more money, they can build more weapons. And, if Putin realizes that the Ukrainians are building this massive defense industrial complex funded by tens of billions or even hundreds of billions of frozen Russian funds, that's going to send a very clear message to him that he has no chance of winning the war. And I think it's that kind of message that could actually bring Putin to the negotiating table for real.
So one country can legally seize the assets of another without violating international law?
Absolutely. And in fact, Congress passed a legislation called the Repo Act that would enhance the president's authority to do just that. We've done that in the past. We've done it with, for example, with Iraqi assets after Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait, which were put into an international trust fund. We can do something very similar with the Russian assets, and that's a position backed by many eminent former officials, including Larry Summers, the former Treasury Secretary, Larry Tribe, the eminent Harvard law professor. Many others are convinced that it's completely lawful and proper to do that. And I think it would be very important as a blow against Russian hopes of winning this war.
Interested in your association in the past with Marco Rubio. I think you were part of his campaign in 2016 when he was running for president, were you not? And do you think that has he distinguished himself as Trump's Secretary of State, given the kinds of things that you're talking about now?
I would not say he has distinguished himself. I mean, I've been very sorry to see the way that he has behaved in terms of closing down USAID, the U.S. Agency for International Development, and now paring back the Department of State. And these are all positions that Senator Rubio would have been very much opposed to. He was a big advocate of U.S. foreign aid as in the battle for influence with China and Russia, Venezuela, Iran, and other countries. I think he understood the importance, or claimed he understood the importance of American soft power. But I feel as Trump's Secretary of State, he's kind of catering to this neo-isolationist wing of the Republican Party and enabling the DOGE-led attack on U.S. Foreign policy programs, which I think is having devastating humanitarian consequences. It's going to lead to large numbers of deaths across the developing world where people are counting on American food and medicine to keep them alive. But it's also going to be a blow to American power and influence because, these kinds of humanitarian programs were a way that the United States could establish relationships and promote its brand around the world. And now, as we're pulling back, we're creating an opening for China and other liberal countries to fill that vacuum. And so I would have never imagined that Marco Rubio, of all people, would be the one presiding over this destruction of American soft power, but that is what is happening now.
You were associated with him in 2016. I take it you don't make regular phone calls recently.
No, definitely not.
Um, you have said that while the president wants to make a showcase of American power, he has done damage to real sources of American strength. And I think one of them would be the kind of soft power that you just talked about a bit. What are some of these other sources of American strength that you think that the president has caused to deteriorate?
Well, I think America is at its best when we stand for our values, and we don't always do that. And there are certainly times when we have to compromise our values and make deals with dictators. But I think we're at our best when we're standing up for the values that make our country great: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and the, promoting the unalienable rights of individuals uh, to freedom, essentially. And that's not something that President Trump is doing. In fact, he's been trying to defund programs like the National Endowment for Democracy, which was started by Ronald Reagan in 1983 to support democracy activists around the world. He's been trying to close down Voice of America, which has been America's leading broadcaster behind the Iron Curtain, and now in places like China, Iran, and North Korea and elsewhere, where people don't have access to accurate and truthful information. VOA and Radio Liberty, Radio Free Europe, Radio Free Asia, Radio Marti, all these other programs, all these other U.S. government entities shine a light on some of the darkest corners of the world. And unfortunately, for some reason, the Trump administration is trying to close down all those programs. It doesn't make a lot of sense because the ostensible justification is, we need to save money, that this is a fiscally conservative move. I mean, it's hard to take that justification seriously when the Republicans just passed this massive tax and spend bill, which is going to add $3 trillion to our national debt. And these programs are a pittance by comparison with the massive tax and spend giveaways that the Republicans are making in their premier legislation. And so it's just it's really doing, really unconscionable damage to America's ability to stand up for our values and to promote our interests around the world.
Which Republicans do you think are the most surprising given what they're going along with, and how it may well contrast, as is the case you indicated with the Secretary of Defense, with the kinds of things that they've done in the past, kinds of things they've said, the positions they've taken?
I mean, it's a very wide number of Republicans. I mean, I think I would say the number of actual kind of MAGA, hardcore, true believer isolationists is pretty small in both the House and in Senate. I mean, there's certainly a few. I mean, the Rand Pauls and Thomas Masseys of the world, but most of the folks in the Republican caucuses are folks who initially supported Ukraine. Many of them have long supported USAID, PEPFAR, a lot of the other programs that the U.S. has undertaken for humanitarian purposes, including, as I mentioned, Marco Rubio was one of the leading supporters of a lot of those. The National Endowment for Democracy, for example, has long had bipartisan support. VOA, most of these agencies and programs were not very controversial. And by the way, I mean, I might have missed something, but in last year's campaign, I didn't hear Trump campaigning on a promise: I'm going to end USAID, I'm going to destroy food aid, I'm going to destroy PEPFAR, I'm going to destroy VOA, I'm going to destroy the NED. He didn't say any of that during the campaign. This wasn't what he got elected on. It just came as a bolt out of the blue, largely driven by Doge. And I think many Republicans were just startled by what was going on and didn't feel like they had any voice or say, and were just, afraid to stand up to Trump. And so they kind of went along with it. But I don't think that they're necessarily ideologically opposed to a lot of these things. They just find it too politically difficult to hold to their prior beliefs.
Has PEPFAR, the program started by George W. Bush, been rescinded, or excuse me, revived, as I understand it might have been?
Part of it's going to be cut less than what Trump initially proposed because there was opposition in the Senate to the rescission bill, which just passed, and so Senator Thune, the Senate Majority Leader, restored some of the funding to PEPFAR, but it's still going to be cut. It's still not what it was a year ago, and they're also cutting programs that provide vaccinations and malaria nets and a lot of other things that save untold numbers of lives. And so, there's no question that a lot of people are going to die because of these cuts in U.S. aid.
You've talked about the slow motion dismantling of the National Security Council. Why is that important, and to what extent does that weaken the United States in terms of its military power?
Well, people don't think about the National Security Council, the NSC, a lot, but it plays a very important behind the scenes function. It was created in 1947 in part to support the president in the making of foreign policy, but also to coordinate foreign policy across all these many different branches of government, whether it's the Defense Department, State, USAID, CIA, Treasury, Commerce, the White House. There are so many aspects of the national security bureaucracy, and it's very easy for them to go off in their own separate directions unless there's somebody at the White House who's bringing them together and making sure that people are on the same wavelength. And that's the job of the NSC. But the NSC has really been very badly diminished in the Trump administration, where Trump fired the national security advisor, and instead of appointing a new national security advisor, he dual-hatted Marco Rubio and said, made Rubio not only Secretary of State, but National Security Advisor. And those are both two big full-time jobs. It's not really possible for one person to do both jobs well. And at the same time, the number of NSC staffers has been reduced by more than half. And so it's an agency that has been really weakened. And I think you can draw a connection between the weakening of the NSC and some of the foreign policy dysfunction we've seen in recent weeks. For example, the fact that, a few weeks ago, Pete Hegseth in the Defense Department suddenly decided to pause aid to Ukraine. And by all accounts, people at the White House didn't know. Even Trump didn't know. Trump was surprised to hear this was going on. This is exactly the kind of policy coordination that needs to happen, and it's not happening. And so, people can do what they want. And I think you're going to look. I'm not naive here. I think you're going to have a baseline of chaos and dysfunction as long as President Trump is in office, because he kind of thrives on chaos and keeping things in an uproar. But I think having the NSC in such a pitifully weak state makes the dysfunction much worse than it needs to be.
There's so much going on, we haven't had time to talk about one of the most dramatic things that has happened in foreign policy, and that, of course, is the U.S. bombing of Iran. Is that an area where you think that the president finally did something right, or are you critical of that as well?
I'm sort of ambivalent about it. I was not an advocate of bombing Iran to begin with, because my position was always that you're going to achieve greater caps on the Iranian nuclear program through negotiations than you will through war. And I think that's basically been vindicated now, because even though the Israelis bombed for 12 days, even though Trump dropped the heaviest non-nuclear munitions in the U.S. arsenal on Fordow and some other Iranian nuclear facilities, even though he did all that, the evidence suggests that the Iranian nuclear program is not obliterated. It's only been set back. And the estimates are that it's been set back by maybe a maximum of 2 to 3 years, which sounds impressive, except you have to remember that President Obama's Iranian nuclear accord from 2015, the JCPOA, that imposed basically a 15-year cap on the Iranian nuclear program. So 15 years is a lot better than 1 to 2 years. And the U.S. bombing, by the accounts I've read, did not destroy all of Iran's fissile material. And so even though it will take the Iranians a few years to reconstitute their program, there is a real danger that they still have enough fissile material to build a bomb, and they may have enough centrifuges in storage facilities to enrich that uranium. to bomb to weapons grade. So I think it's a very dangerous situation. I mean, I think, I'm not that critical of Trump's decision because I think once the Israelis started bombing the Iranian program, there was a logic to saying like, okay, we don't want to wound the Iranians, but leave them with their entire nuclear program intact. So, dropping the heavy bombs on Fordow may have made sense, but it really only is going to be effective if the bombing campaign is a prelude to an enhanced Iranian nuclear accord. It's not going to be a substitution for it.
So, did the bombing make it easier or more difficult to ultimately get Iran, excuse me, back to the bargaining table?
Well, that's the $64 question right now, and we don't know the answer to that. You can argue it either way. I mean, the Iranians have actually given some indications that they're still interested in reaching a deal. And you can argue it either way. I mean, you can argue, A, the bombing showed the Iranians the consequences of pursuing a nuclear program and, you know, maybe convince them that they need to make a deal, otherwise they're just going to get bombed again. On the other hand, you can argue it the other way, and you can imagine that Iranian hardliners, the lesson they're taking away from this is, unless we have a nuclear bomb, we're going to be attacked again in the future. So we need to race and develop a nuclear bomb as the North Koreans did. Nobody's bombing North Korea, and they're going to bomb Iran again unless we, the Iranians, have a nuclear bomb. So you can imagine this, and I think that there is this debate going on within the Iranian government between the moderates and the hardliners. And in terms of who comes out ahead, which argument prevails, I think we just don't know yet.
One of the great things about America at a Crossroads is that viewers and listeners get to participate and ask questions. And I have them, some of them in front of me on chat, and I would encourage people to continue to contribute to the chat column. So let me begin by asking you what A. Anderson poses here. He says, is Trump really moving away from Putin, considering that many intelligence experts and groups monitoring Russia have been fired?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think this is an unfortunate, destruction of American foreign policy capacity, and there is no question that there are large-scale firings at the State Department, which include folks who work on Russia and related issues, as well as on China and other issues, and that I think is deeply unfortunate. But I do think that Trump has moved to at least to some amount of distance away from Putin in the last week. I think that's just, that's certainly the import of his announcement on Monday. Now, of course, Trump is very unpredictable and very inconsistent. So it's possible maybe he will zigzag back to Russia in the future. But right now, I think he's more on Ukraine's side than he's ever been before.
Ruth Rothschild asks this: do you think that Trump's sudden support for sending more military and financial aid to Ukraine is related to his wanting to be awarded a Nobel Peace Prize, especially since his base is strongly against any aid of any kind for Ukraine?
I don't know. It's very hard to psychoanalyze him. I mean, clearly he does want a Nobel Peace Prize, and he feels sort of aggrieved that he has not gotten one. And clearly he wants to end the war in Ukraine. But I was arguing all along, and many other people were arguing all along, that if Trump wants to end the war in Ukraine, he has to provide more support to Ukraine to convince the Russians that they're not going to win the war. This was, obvious from day one, and it seems like it's taken, Trump 6 months to internalize that lesson. And I don't know why he did. Maybe he's, seeing that Nobel Peace Prize slip away. But if so, more power to him. I mean, if he can actually end the war in Ukraine on terms that guarantee the future sovereignty and security of Ukraine, I would vote to give him that Peace Prize.
This is something you have touched on before, but Victor wants to know, isn't Trump's 50-day deadline giving Putin 2 months to bomb the hell out of Ukraine?
Well, yeah. I mean, there's no doubt about it. I mean, if I had my druthers, he would be imposing sanctions on Ukraine right now, not in September. But it's nevertheless, and again, as we discussed, I mean, I have some doubts as to whether he's really going to impose 100% tariffs on Russia's trade partners come September. But nevertheless, I think it is sending a signal of disenchantment with Putin and the Kremlin. And I think, the weapons deliveries, assuming that they happen in a timely fashion, I think that's that's backing up his words with some more serious actions.
Grigor wants to know this, and back to the book. Given your expertise on former President Reagan, how do you think President Reagan might have reacted or responded had the invasion of Ukraine happened under his watch?
Well, it's hard to channel somebody who's been dead all these years, but you can certainly draw inferences from President Reagan's support for the Afghan Mujahideen fighting the Red Army in the 1980s, or the Nicaraguan Contras fighting the Sandinistas. I think we can pretty readily surmise that the Reagan administration would have provided weapons to the Ukrainians, much in the same way as the Biden administration did. I mean, I think that's been a pretty traditional Republican foreign policy position, which is to stand up to Russian aggression, which is why it's been so startling to see somebody like President Trump come to power, who has up until now has espoused very different and very contrary views. But, I think what you've seen in the last few days is that President Trump is sounding a little, at least when it comes to Russia and NATO, he's sounding a little bit more like a traditional Republican than he has in the past.
You indicated before that the United States has some $50 billion worth of Russian assets that it could seize. Philip wants to know about the Allies. Why have they not, they have much more than we do, to this point appropriated the several hundred billion in Russian assets, or deposits, I should say, in the West for the purchase of weapons for Ukraine?
That's a great question. I mean, I think there are a lot of arguments for inaction. I don't find them compelling, but I think this is kind of the reflexive bureaucratic response to say, like, oh, we can't confiscate the Russian assets because, the sanctity of private property, and who knows where this is going to end. Maybe our assets will be confiscated in the future, and we need to hold on to. There's also kind of a more practical argument. We need to hold on to the Russian assets as bargaining chips in negotiations at the end of the war. All these kinds of arguments are made, but I don't find any of those particularly compelling, because what I would say is, yeah, if you're going to go out and invade your neighbor, you should expect to have your foreign assets confiscated. That maybe we should make that, a matter of course in international politics, that you can't get away with unprovoked aggression, that there should be a consequence, as there was for Iraq after Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. So now you should have the same consequence for Putin after invading Ukraine. And I don't think this is going to undermine the dollar. I don't think it's going to undermine the international monetary system. I think people understand this is a very unusual circumstance, and Russia really brought this on itself.
Several people, including Joyce and Sandra, have asked why you think that the 5% increase in NATO's spending is smoke and mirrors. I don't know where you said that, but
Yeah.
I assume they're right.
Well, if you break that down, what NATO has really agreed to is that they will increase their defense spending to 3% of GDP, and from their current target, or sorry, they'll increase it to 3.5% of GDP from their current target of 2%. And then they're going to add 1.5% of GDP on top of that for doing some things like strengthening roads and bridges, which, in theory can have a military function, but basically is just constructing infrastructure. And so that's how the European allies said that they were satisfying Trump's demand that they spend 5% of GDP on defense. So I think it is a little bit of smoke and mirrors, but I think it's totally justifiable because, hey, guess what? Even the United States, we're not spending 5% of GDP on defense either. We're spending about 3.4% of GDP on defense. So I think it was kind of unreasonable of Trump to ask our allies to spend more on defense than we're actually spending. And so, I think it's perfectly fine that they figured out a way to make him happy without, actually spending 5% of GDP on defense, which is going to be very hard for them to do just economically.
Here's Victor again. Are there people around Putin who could throw him over? Are there people concerned about the losses being incurred by the military and the possible impact on the economy? Related to that, with hundreds of thousands of dead Russian soldiers, why is there not more rebellion on the part of the Russian people?
I mean, these are all good questions. I mean, clearly there are a lot of people in Russia who are unhappy with the war, and it wasn't like there was any huge demand from the Russian people to invade Ukraine in 2022. That was really Putin's initiative, and he hatched it in secret and sprang it even on his own military commanders, out of the blue. But Russia is really a one-man dictatorship right now. I mean, Putin has the greatest degree of totalitarian control over Russia of any leader since Stalin. So there's just no room for any kind of opposition, and there's certainly no indication of any competing power centers or anybody who is capable of throwing him out of office. Uh, Even though I think there is a lot of dissatisfaction, and if you look at public opinion polls in Russia, and public opinion polls in Russia are dubious because it's not a free country, but even the public opinion polls that they allow show that most Russians want a negotiated solution. They don't want to keep fighting indefinitely, but there is just no forcing mechanism there because Putin has such complete control over every aspect of the state and society that this is not like LBJ during the Vietnam War. He doesn't have to worry about mass protests or draft resistance or draft riots or anything like that. Basically, the Russian population is acquiescing in the war, and so he's able to continue to fight the war, even though it's taking a terrible, terrible toll on the Russian soldiers.
Back to chat. Christina says, ever since Trump made his 50-day announcement, Senator Thune has expressed that he is not putting S-1241, the Sanctioning Russia Act of 2025, up for a vote immediately, as has been expected. The bill has overwhelming bipartisan support. Didn't Trump just give Putin another extended deadline?
Yeah, basically. I mean, the legislation you're talking about is the bill sponsored by Lindsey Graham and Richard Blumenthal that would impose 500% tariffs on countries that are buying Russian oil and gas. Now, it's not strictly necessary because I think Trump already has the authority to impose tariffs, and he threatened to impose 100% tariffs. And as he pointed out, there's no real difference between 100% and 500%. What that in either of those tariffs, that basically means we're going to cut off all trade with the United States. But I question, I just don't think that's a realistic threat, as we were discussing, because are we really going to cut off all U.S. trade with countries like China, India, South Korea, and others that are purchasers of Russian oil and gas? It seems unlikely to me. Maybe some of these countries will wean themselves off of Russian oil and gas, but I doubt all of them would, and I'm not sure we're going to risk the international financial and economic meltdown that could result if all of a sudden we're imposing 100% or 500% tariffs. So I don't view the actual specifics of the threat as being all that credible, but I do think it does have a signaling function because I think the mobilization in the Senate behind this legislation, which now has something like 85 co-sponsors, I think it does put pressure on Trump, and it could help to account for why he is suddenly sounding tougher on Russia. And I think it's certainly sending a signal to the Kremlin that the United States is not going to walk away from Ukraine.
Here's a question from Judith of Dresher, Pennsylvania. Could you comment on the state of Russia's economy? Are reports of its near collapse if the war continues much longer exaggerated?
That sounds exaggerated to me. I think there was a lot of hope that the Russian economy would collapse because of all the sanctions that were put on it in 2022. And instead, it actually managed to grow over the last couple of years. But now I think that the Russian economy is in a downturn. I think they are experiencing high inflation. They are experiencing, economic pressures because basically Putin has mobilized the wartime economy, and he's been able to do that because of Russia's oil revenues, which have kept flowing in with sales again, to countries like China, India, Turkey, South Korea and others, but it is placing a major strain on the Russian economy to devote so much of the economic output to the war effort. They've also, lost a lot of people who fled the country, a lot of, men who have been wounded or killed in action. So they're losing a lot of workers. And so the inflationary pressures and other pressures are continuing to grow in the Russian economy. All that said, I would not expect the Russian economy to simply collapse anytime soon. And I don't think that so far we've seen any kind of economic crisis severe enough to force Putin to end the war. But I think it is something probably in the back of Putin's mind. I mean, he has to think about what is the economic impact of keeping the economy going indefinitely. And I think right now there are some warning bells going off about the prospects for the Russian economy that I think he has to be wary of.
Phil from Flagstaff wants to know this. Do you think Trump will send offensive weapons to Ukraine and then he will empower Ukraine to use them against Russia? Otherwise, how long can Ukraine, which has 30% of Russia's population, stay in this war of attrition? I don't know about that 30%. Go ahead.
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know the answer to that. It's Trump sends very mixed signals. There was a report in the Financial Times this week that Trump asked Zelensky if Ukraine could hit Moscow and St. Petersburg and, suggested to Zelensky that he do so. But yesterday, Trump was asked by reporters if he wanted Ukraine to target Moscow with long-range weapons, and he said no. So, he's sending very contradictory messages there. I mean, I would say from my own vantage point, I think it does make sense, and it is in fact imperative for Ukraine to hit targets inside Russia. I don't think they should be hitting civilian population centers. I don't think the Ukrainians should be committing war crimes in the way that the Russians are. But I think it is important for the Ukrainians to hit Russian air bases, to hit Russian oil refineries, to hit Russian weapons plants, a lot of targets that support the Russian war effort. And the Ukrainians have done that. I mean, remember a few months ago, they had this very daring operation to infiltrate drones into Russia and to use them to attack Russian air bases and to hit a lot of the long-range bombers that Russia has been using to launch missiles against Ukraine. So I think they need to be able to do more of that. And I would hope that the US and our allies would supply them with more long-range weapons that they can use to take out those legitimate military targets inside Russia.
Here's Lynn who says this, Mr. Boot, why would American government take Russian money and give it away? If the U.S. government took money from the Russians, shouldn't we keep it to pay the American people back for all of our tax dollars that have been pumped into this event?
Well, I think we're already receiving a massive return on investment in terms of our support for Ukraine. If you assume, as I do, that Russia is a threat not just to Ukraine, but to Europe and to the United States, the Ukrainians are demolishing the Russian military without putting a single American soldier in harm's way. So I think they are doing a tremendous service to the United States, to NATO, to Europe by stopping this Russian onslaught before it reaches deeper into Europe. I think it is certainly possible that some of those impounded Russian funds could be used to buy weapons from the United States. So they would go to American defense manufacturers. And that, in fact, has already been, by the way, the case with a lot of the aid that we've given to Ukraine. A lot of the money has actually gone, to American defense companies to make weapons, which they then send to Ukraine. So it's been benefiting Ukraine, but it's also been benefiting the American defense sector. And I think certainly, some of that frozen Russian money could be used for similar purposes in the future. But I think, as we were discussing earlier, we would get more bang for the buck and a more sustainable defense of Ukraine if we sent more of that money to Ukraine so they could use it to build up their own defense sector, or they can manufacture equipment much cheaper than the United States and to free themselves ultimately from dependence on the US and Europe. And there's just something in the nature of poetic justice to be using Russian money to defeat this Russian invasion.
Philip wants to know, if Putin ever decides to sit down at the bargaining table with Ukraine, what do you think his most important demands will be?
Well, we know what his demands have been up until now, because he has sat down with Ukraine, but he has not made any concessions. And his demands basically have amounted to the unconditional surrender of Ukraine because he wants to keep the 20% of Ukraine that he's already occupied, but he also actually wants more land because he has claimed to annex 4 provinces of Ukraine, which he does not fully occupy. So, he wants the Ukrainians to turn over to him land which he hasn't actually conquered. He also wants Ukraine to be cut off from aid from the West. He wants Ukraine to accept onerous caps on the size of its armed forces. He wants regime change in Kiev. So basically, at the end of the day, he wants Ukraine to be a Russian colony. Those are the demands that he has been making at the negotiating table. So those are not serious demands. Those are not demands that any Ukrainian government could possibly accept. And so I think the question becomes, can you convince him to pare down his demands? And, what would, a compromise that the Ukrainians could live with, what would that look like? And I suspect that it could look like something like allowing the Russians to continue occupying, the 20% of Ukraine that they already occupy. But, Ukraine in turn would need some kind of guarantees against further Russian aggression. What the Ukrainians really want is NATO membership, which is something that is obviously anathema to Putin. But I think that's the kind of security guarantee that would have to be part of the negotiation of the final status negotiations for the Ukrainians to have any confidence that making peace with Russia will actually result in their long-term security.
We have a lot more questions, but we simply don't have time to get to them. And it's a tradition on this program to ask the guest, especially after a program with such heavy issues involved as this one, to ask the guest if there's anything you can say that would make people optimistic about what the future might hold.
Well, as I was saying, I'm actually a little bit more optimistic right now than I would have been a week ago because I did not expect this turnaround from Trump, where he seems to be seriously aggrieved at Putin. And, again, there are limitations to his agreement, and we can question how serious his tariff threats are. But, assuming he carries out his promise to sell weapons to Ukraine, I think that's a very significant development. I think this is a real blow to Russian hopes and something that bolsters hope in Ukraine and hopefully will protect Ukrainian cities from continuing Russian air attacks. So I think, I don't want to exaggerate the importance of this, but it is something that gives me a little bit of hope for the future.
Can we dispense then with taco, or is that still hanging over our heads?
You never know. I mean, Trump is very unpredictable. He's prone to say one thing and do another, and sometimes that has good results, sometimes bad results. So, you know, I'm not making any predictions about the future. I'm just saying right now, I'm feeling a little bit more positive about the situation than I was a week ago.
Well, thank you. And it's been a real pleasure to speak with you, as it always is. And thank you so very much for being with us and being so responsive to so many questions coming at you from different points of view. I think our listeners have participated in a meaningful way as well. And I want to thank them too. Max Booth, many, many thanks. Look forward to talking to you again.
Thanks for having me. Always a pleasure to be back with you.
America at a Crossroads next week. It's going to be Paul Maslin and Mike Murray with Pat Morrison. What does Washington's chaos portend for the 2026 midterm? It's never too early to talk about those. Thanks again to everybody for listening and watching. See you next week.